Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Global Learning, a presentation by Julie Dierberger, Benjamin Lamb, Jillian Reading, and Nissa Salazar. Today we're going to learn about global learning in the context of higher education primarily. The first thing that we should do here is define what global learning is. Coming to one set definition that describes what global learning is and what makes up a global citizen can vary from institution to institution and country to country. For the context of this particular presentation, here's a variety of terms that we plan on using for the duration. Global learning. Global learning involves the combination of technology that supplies global reach and global perspectives that arise from interactions between learners of different cultures. Citizenship is membership of an individual to a political community defined within the contours of the nation-state, excluding people outside of those boundaries, but including those that are undocumented. Global citizenship is the multidimensional construct that hinges on the interrelated dimensions of global citizenship, social responsibility, global competence, and global civic engagement. Global competence is having an open mind while actively seeking to understand cultural norms and expectations of others, leveraging this gained knowledge to interact, communicate, and work effectively outside one's environment. Finally, cosmopolitan. This is a composite of the Greek words for order, universe, and citizen, meaning familiar or at ease in many different countries and cultures. Now that we have something of a definition and a series of terms that we can utilize, it's also important to understand the history of global learning. Global learning has literally been around since ancient Greece. It's something that's been integrated into education, from higher education to lower education and primary school, for eons. Some important points to make here is that the origination of global learning is based in Socrates' work in Greece. Please read here. Challenging the polis, city-state in ancient Greece, Socrates, when asked of what country he was, said, "Not of Athens, but of the world." Later on, civic life later defined by Romans based on the accident of our birth, meaning that where we are in the world just happens to be where we were born, and that we are still a citizen of the world. Immanuel Kant once was a powerful cosmopolitan thinker, pushed to gain ground on cosmopolitan rights, and wrote in his perpetual piece, a philosophical sketch, "The peoples of earth have thus entered in varying degrees into a universal community, and it has developed to the point where a violation of rights in one part of the world is felt everywhere." This is true of not just global learning, but globalized society, whereby we feel the impact of what's happening in other places of the world just as much as they feel what we're doing here. If you look at the brief timeline above, you'll notice some key points. While we did note the earliest, meaning Socrates and in the 17th century with Immanuel Kant, there was also some key points throughout the last century and a half. In the 1920s, the roots of global education in Europe was based on peacekeeping attempts. This was prior to World War II. In 1945, or after 1945 rather, this flourished under the banner of Education for International Understanding. You see a lot of programs that developed internationally based on global learning and global thinking at that time. In 1948, with the UN signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we saw the advancement of these programs and further. And then in the late 1960s, global education developed as a curricular reform movement, being integrated into more curriculums and more institutions more broadly across the US and beyond. When we hit the 1980s, we see a very large influx here. The influence of the new model of global citizen began going back to the cosmopolitan ideas of universal community, whereby we're all part of a globalized community. Additionally, the idea of world citizenship began to recede. So rather than being a world citizen, we were global citizens. In the 1990s, promises of emerging global society became far more evident with advances in digital technology and telecommunication. We can pretty much extrapolate out from the 1990s to the current point in time, whereby we see that digital technology has played a key integral part in the actual global learning aspect of our world. It has advanced us to a point where we can actually interact with somebody all the way around the world on any day, any time, via digital technology. Global learning around the world is the next point that we should touch on here, as we are not purely focusing on global learning in the US, but rather how it is perceived around the world. National education policies are something that every country has in place in one way, shape, or form. Some are very limited, others are more advanced. Countries around the world have created national education policies that create standard objectives relating to global education. Some examples here include Europe and Australia, where global education programs are offered at all levels, from what we would consider K through 12 in the US all the way through higher education. In Singapore, online teaching integration is opening the door to globalized educational opportunity, much more than Singapore had experienced prior. In the US, having developed study abroad programs, research abroad, exchange programs, and international student programs, we've seen a very large influx in what our global education and national education policies look like as they're combined together. Further education is a particular example in England. What we might consider further education is our higher education system in the United States. But with a lack of national policy enforcing implementation of global learning, Benthall et al. Conducted an interview. In this study, 4 major factors were identified for staff progress in order to integrate further global learning into the classroom. The first one being existing institutional priorities and overseas partnerships. When an institution had the priority of global learning, it was more easy to integrate into the classroom. When overseas partnerships already existed, it also made that easier as there could be outreach done and connectivity made. Number 2, personal experience and enthusiasm of staff. When someone had an experience and they were enthusiastic about the work, it was much easier for them to build it into their curriculum. Number 3, the level of subject and profile of students. When we look at the level of education, whether it's primary school or in further education, there's obviously an ability to integrate it more at a higher level, especially in the further education system. When the profile of students is taken into account, we have to think about the demographics and how in touch the community at large is with the idea of global learning. Number 4, examine syllabus requirements. This is something that we can see internationally as both an impediment and a tool to be used in order to integrate global learning. If exams and syllabi require individuals to integrate global learning into their classrooms, it's more likely that it will do so. Strategic frameworks and best practices. Throughout the readings, there was a number of frameworks that we found that could be applied very easily to global learning and education in higher ed. The first one is providing global education to K through 12. As we've discussed in the course up to this point, this seems to be a fairly common thread in some of our discussions. Education instructors have the ability to create strong future global leaders who have the capacity to take on high-level global changes. To achieve this, Gibson et al. Developed a framework. 1, it provided authentic experiences with the highest level of cultural contrast. Number 2, provide modern communication technologies to interact around the world. Much of this is done organically through the technology that we have on hand. Results of this practice will produce global learners and leaders that will have 1, cultural sensitivity, 2, global awareness, 3, technological awareness and skills, 4, intercultural communication and interpersonal intelligence, 5, reflective and interpersonal intelligence, 6, collaboration skills, 7, critical thinking, and 8, world citizenship skills. The Intercultural Development Inventory, or the IDI, was derived from the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, or the DMIS, as some may be familiar with. The IDI was created to measure the intercultural sensitivity. The IDI measures 6 phases of intercultural sensitivity. Number 1, denial. 2, defense reversal. 3, minimalization. 4, acceptance. 5, adaptation. 6, integration. When these were all put together and a formula was put into place, it was found that a 5-dimensional model most applied to the general population. In order to do this, there was combinations made of many of the 6 phases previously noted. These ended up looking like 1, denial defense and reversal, 2, minimalization on its own, number 3, acceptance adaptation, number 4, world-mindedness, and number 5, encapsulated marginality. Before we move away from this point, it should be important to note that intercultural sensitivity is defined as sensitive enough to notice cultural differences and then also be willing to modify their behavior as an indication of respect for the people of another culture. Additionally, it should be noted that this inventory was tested at multiple dimensions by the researchers and validated to be used on campuses abroad. The 3D Global Learning Model is a model that's based on 3 different phases, thus the 3D name. Number 1 is defining the meaning, outcomes, and competencies. These are based on individual needs via mission and vision statements, as well as campus-wide discussions that will also help with this. Number 2, designing the programs and experiences to align with the outcomes and competencies brought up in the defining stage. And number 3, demonstrating the effectiveness of the application of the experiences in terms of the achievement of said outcomes and competencies. Utilizing this 3D approach, one is able to move through the phases and then cycle back through in defining in the future if need be. The global competence model is based on 3 concentric circles, basically layered like an onion around the central idea of self-awareness. The core of this is openness, diversity recognition of others' differences, and non-judgmental reactions. The middle layer is based on globalization and knowing world history. And finally, the outer layer is the ability to collaborate across cultures, effectively participate both socially and in business globally, and to assess intercultural performance and identify cultural differences to compete globally. Results of this study support higher education's ability to create experiences inside and outside the classroom on campuses across the world to develop culturally competent students. LEAP and ELO, or ELO. Hovland and Schneider declare that global learning should be included within learning outcomes that are being created by institutions. I quote, "Only 5 to 10% of U.S. college graduates have the appropriate mix of studies, sufficient language, 4 or more courses on culture other than their own, and international experience to qualify as globally prepared." In order to address this issue, the authors propose that the use of the liberal education and America's promise and essential learning outcomes can create a dynamic and globally prepared student through exposure of liberal education. Managing internationalization. This requires the administration and leaders to support and examine 8 coexisting layers. 1. Recruiting students. 2. Teaching international learners. 3. Growing the international enterprise university. 4. Respecting international standards. 5. Internationalization at home. 6. Education for global citizenship. 7. Connected e-learning. And 8. Education for planetary consciousness. All of these, working together in concert, produce what one might consider an internationalization of higher education and educational systems in general. Implementing practice. This is really important because everything that we work towards is really towards implementation and practice, whether it's research-based, scholarly works, or actually the day-to-day activity that is global learning. Developing global education. Davies and Pike provide 5 recommendations for developing global education. 1. Go beyond the nation-state and expand the boundaries of our current school priorities. This means including neighboring countries and those across the world. 2. Go beyond individualism and national perspective and provide opportunities for global learning for all, not just the elite. This historically had been an issue where only the elite were really provided the opportunities to travel abroad and gain a true global perspective. Recently, more scholarships and opportunities have been provided for all students in order to allow them to go abroad and to gain these same experiences. Number 3, enable deeper understanding and facilitate global experiences through the development of quality teacher education programs. If we educate our teachers better, our students will be educated better in the long term. Number 4, promote knowledge and skills for public life by bringing together splintered frameworks. This includes a lot of cohesion of what might have been considered non-cohesion elements in the past. Number 5, build a process to sustain global experience and understanding and the appropriate facilitation to create critical thought. In the end, critical thought is a huge part of global thinking and global education. If we can't think critically, how can we actually think through the problems that we have to face? The value belief norm, or VBN theory of pro-environmental behavior, is another theory that can be applied to global learning. VBN theory suggests an individual will be motivated by an internalized personal norm to respond to environmental issues that threaten the welfare of others. In the South Pacific, the study abroad programs benefit from accessibility. They give accessibility to diverse populations of participants, a depth of immersion, and service learning components, which altogether work to create a holistic experience for the students, centralized on environmental issues that might threaten them or others that they are aware of. In New Zealand, exposing students to a wide breadth of cultural elements can both reflect on how the environment impacts the culture and the culture in return impacts the environment. This creates an environmental psychology aspect that really plays into a pro-environmental behavior. VBN drives individuals to pursue environmentally friendly behavior and intentionally translate that into global citizenship in the long run. Education in real time. Education amongst higher education institutions is becoming consistent today due to real time. Real time is what allows interaction with people across the globe in a matter of seconds. Global education in real time. This means communicating with someone around the world via any kind of methodology, whether it's the phone, Skype, or another digital technology. Three emerging globalizing practices in education that demonstrate how education works in real time include harmonizing of higher education, national curriculum, and international testing that goes beyond the borders of an individual country. This cartoon here, you might be able to perceive it in any particular fashion of your own. From the perspective of this group, it really applies to how we see global education in the US and how it may have been treated in the past. In the past, we may have seen it as we invite others to us, and thus force them to fit within the construct that we have in front of us. While this might be very easy for Mr. Monkey to climb a tree, Mr. Elephant might not be able to make it up there, and Miss Fish might even have more of a problem. In this kind of image, we try to represent how the other students from other places can't exactly get up the tree as fast or as easily as the ones that are from there. It's important to think this through as we are looking at global education because we are not trying to turn them into US citizens or US students. We are trying to integrate what great things they bring to the US educational system and use that as a growth tool for all members of an educational community. Assessment and evaluation of global learning. If nothing else, we need to be able to assess and evaluate the global learning that we are trying to procure in our educational environments. The assessment model is used for both student and program learning outcomes with the following framework. 1. Inputs, 2. Activities, 3. Outputs, 4. Outcomes, and 5. Impact. These frameworks, when set across the various levels of impact, thinking macro, meso, and micro, show the levels of impact from internationalization with higher education. There's an issue though. No one size fits all. Issues with assessments such as this rely on self-reported measures using convenience data instead of rigorous methodology, which makes it more difficult to carry through to any given institution or any other nation's educational system. Areas for improvement. 3 areas for which campuses can improve their intentionality and practice in global education. 1. Goal setting across the institution. This could include identifying overarching institutional goals with key stakeholders. 2. Connecting historical information and institutional goals clearly. And 3. Align goals with divisional and departmental goals, then general education, then individual course level, and lastly with academic and student affairs, so that it touches on all levels of the educational system. 2. Translating goals into assessment frameworks. And 3. Modes of evaluating learning goals. The challenges of global learning. While it might sound great to just be able to integrate global learning into any educational environment, there are many challenges that do confront it and have held it back in some cases. There are a number of global education challenges. Global education undermines the development of patriotism and the lack of belonging to a place as a citizen. Instead, the person is a citizen of the world. To some, this can feel like a somewhat aggressive approach. However, in reality, thinking of global education and globalized citizenship, it does in a sense require a little bit of moving away from a nationalized perspective. Global education is 1. Vague, uncertain, disconnected from the place. 2. Educational goals are confused. 3. Global education muddies the water for information that can't be connected. 4. It does not allow a community of adults to pass down their established values and morals. 5. Teachers must teach lessons and classroom materials based on content not in a global context. The non-mobile majority. Those are those that are unable to travel internationally and can still become global citizens. It's important to address this population, as it's not always a requirement to become globalized, meaning that you don't have to travel around the world in order to gain the same educational experience. Here's another drawing, and this one I'm just going to let you take in. Note all of the symbolic pieces of this art. There's a number of them there, and I'd like you to think through for a minute. How does this connect to global learning? Now that you've had a second to think about it, I'd like you to jot those things down really quickly. I want you to think about how global learning is both challenging and a huge contributor to our educational system. As you think through the rest of global learning and as we go through the rest of this course, I want you to reflect on those notes, and I want you to think back to this image. How does our history, our future, our contemporary society play into global education? How do those challenges play out? What does our infrastructure do for us? What doesn't it do for us? So as you go forward, please do keep that in mind. As we move forward in the field, it's important to think about research and future growth of global learning, as it is an area that is continually developing and will continue to need to do so. Research. In order to prepare students for global citizenship, higher education institutions must surpass the boundaries of international social student mobility to cosmopolitanism, according to Caruana, 2014. Diverse students, in the face of cultural dissonance, utilize resilience to adapt and conform to global learning situations. Providing a supportive framework for allowing students to work through this in a global learning environment is essential, and we as educators need to be the catalyst to perform that duty. Future growth. This includes the goal to develop knowledge and skills as well as positive values and participation across all learning areas and stages of learning. As we've touched on multiple times in this course already, thinking in a K through 16 or beyond is really important when we look at global education. 4 key factors to assist in integrating global learning include: 1. Institutions drive their own global learning beyond the national policy requirements, meaning that although national policy requirements might exist, it's important to try to surpass those and exceed the base level that is required. Number 2, an emphasis on pre-existing relationships and partnerships. While we have these relationships and partnerships, we may not be utilizing them most effectively. It's better to have a friend before you need a friend. That's been my saying. Number 3, experience and enthusiasm to drive global learning into the curricula and create a critical mass. By critical mass, we mean that you need to really integrate enough so that there's more enthusiasm. As more enthusiasm exists, the drive will continue to push forward, and the future generation will continue to keep that car on the road. Number 4, development of frameworks to create structure for program development. With frameworks, it makes it much easier to carry over a model into a different institution or a different educational environment. If we have these frameworks preset, then we can create a structure for program development to trickle down into the curriculum. The 5 elements of potential growth in global education, according to Bista and Saleh, is 1. Interdependence, 2. Globalization, 3. Identity and cultural diversity, 4. Social justice and human rights, 5. Peace building and conflict resolution, and 6. Sustainable futures. Taking these elements into hand, it will really help us to continue to grow the field of global education and pursue it further into the next generation of education. That's all we have today. We hope that you enjoyed, and we hope that you learned something from this experience. Below, we have a number of references, which we will also leave up here so that you can continue to go through and do your own research in a future time. If you have any questions, please feel free to email any of the 4 of us, as we would be more than happy to continue the dialogue and continue the conversation in critical context of global education and what it looks like for our field and the field of the future. Thank you.